So I want to welcome everybody. Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Michelle Sakurka. I'm the president and CEO of the New Jersey Business and Industry Association. And today we're going to talk about Decision 2020, what legalized cannabis means for business. Right now, New Jersey voters are already casting ballots for the November 3rd election and on public question number 1, which is the constitutional amendment to legalize recreational marijuana. Cannabis is already legal for medicinal use in New Jersey and in 32 other states. If Garden State voters decide to expand legalization to adult use recreational marijuana, what will that mean and what will the impact be on New Jersey businesses? Today, we will explore a wide range of issues relating to legalizing the adult use cannabis industry in New Jersey, including tax revenue projections, job creation, workplace safety, impacts to employment laws affecting employer liability and worker disability protections, and more. I want to thank all our panelists and know that our participants will be greatly informed from today's program. Today's program includes an opening and closing keynote with a great panel in between. Please utilize the chat function to ask questions, and I'll do my best to channel those questions to our speakers throughout the program. And also, you'll see that there are some documents posted, the agenda, as well as some handouts. So please make use of those as we go through the program today. Now, with that, allow me to introduce our opening keynote, Dr. Kevin Sabet. Dr. Sabet serves as president and CEO for Smart Approaches to Marijuana. He's a former advisor to 3 U.S. presidential administrations and an adjunct at Yale University. He's also the author of Reefer Sanity, 7 Great Myths About Marijuana. Dr. Sabet, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle, and I want to thank the New Jersey Business Industry and Industry Association for hosting this. There really hasn't been much discussion of marijuana at all in New Jersey. Obviously, there are probably more pressing issues happening. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. We have a contentious election upon us, and there's a lot of other things happening. But it has been interesting how this has been very, very little discussion on this. You know, one thing I'll say before jumping into how this is going to affect business, because I actually think this is the sleeping giant. I think this is going to affect business tremendously, and I don't think business is sort of understanding that right now. It just kind of seems, oh, whatever, they'll legalize some weed. What's the big deal? But one thing else, it's very interesting because this is only on the ballot because it passed by 1 vote in both the Assembly and the Senate. In fact, the winning vote for this to be on the ballot was by a senator who's vehemently against legalization, but he wanted the people to decide, which is very interesting. But this almost wasn't even going to be on the vote. It had a horrible, terrible time in the legislature getting any kind of, traction, even though this was a priority for the governor. So there's been huge pushback. I do think that there's a lot of misunderstanding by people on what this is even about. So I think there's going to be a lot of confusion. But the pro side has outspent the con side 130 to 1, with Scott's Miracle Grow just donating $800,000 because they see this as good for their business. But what may be good for a few businesses, especially the pot businesses, I think are going to be very difficult and frankly very bad for other businesses. And let me just explain why. So hopefully you will see my screen here. Just a little bit about SAM. We're a 501c4 and a 501c3. We're dedicated to science. I actually started SAM when I left the Obama administration in 2011. I was the senior advisor, and I started it with Patrick Kennedy, a New Jersey resident, right, whose wife's certainly made a lot of news lately, and down in South Jersey. But C3 and C4, where we have multiple organizations, we promote evidence-based approaches. We're not about reefer madness. We're not about having a partisan view. We're about the science, and we actually rely on top researchers from around the world. We work with all the major medical associations. So really, we really are not about kind of having rhetoric. We're about the science here. And I think there are 3 separate issues that often get conflated. People sometimes think we're talking about decriminalization, which is very, very different than legalization. Decriminalization would remove penalties, whereas medical marijuana is also very different. Now, of course, we've had medical marijuana for quite a while in New Jersey, albeit very limited. And then legalization, the actual vote in November, in 2 weeks, is a completely different ball game than these other policies. And I worry just about the effects of this, because as I'm going to show you, today's pot is not your Woodstock weed. And we now have a record number of people using marijuana every day, especially compared to alcohol, even though those numbers used to be the same back in the 90s. In fact, we have 10 times as many daily users now than we did in 1992. That's a humongous difference. And it's been brought on by the normalization and commercialization, I would say, of marijuana. We have driving as a huge issue. In fact, there was a recent study showing that if you legalize it federally, you have 7,000 more deaths on the road, which I think is extremely worrying. But we at SAM have really been pushing science. We've been pushing, we don't want people arrested and thrown in prison. I think we really, and I hope the panelists, I'm sure they will sort of discuss this nuance. There's a big difference between decriminalization, throwing people in prison, expunging records or not expunging records, and commercializing the sales of marijuana. Very, very different things. We work with a very broad array of folks, which I'm not going to dwell on because I really want to get into the business part. We do have a new publication that you might find interesting, but I'm not going to go through at all. We don't have the time on our website, which goes through lessons learned in the states like Colorado and Washington that have legalized. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned. I mean, one lesson is that the majority of localities do not want legal pot in their state. So even if it passes statewide here in New Jersey, you can expect many, already they already have, of course, many townships, many villages, many cities ban the sales of marijuana. That's going to be a very interesting dynamic. But we have a lot of other things. And again, I don't want to dwell on, we have a lot of science here. Actually, we have a lot of science showing marijuana exacerbates mental illness and ADD and PTSD. And there's a new autism study that's very concerning. I'm not going to go through the science and the studies because I really want to talk about business here. Let me tell you why I truly think this is very bad for business, this initiative. Number one, legal pot poses unique dangers to the workplace. These are the 4 issues. I'll go into some detail. And again, we'll make sure this is available to you. First of all, greater negative impact on workplace performance than alcohol. Very high potency marijuana. This is not your grandfather's weed or your father's weed or your older sibling's weed. This is much more potent than it used to be. It can be 99% a potent THC with these dabs that are out there. And if you don't know what dabs or shatter or wax is, Google it. You will be shocked in what you see, I think. They're easily concealed now with the vaping devices. I mean, forget about it. This isn't about the old roach clip. You could smell from the boys' bathroom down the hall back in high school. This is totally different. And long-lasting effects. Marijuana, actually, the effects last much longer than a lot of other drugs, including alcohol. And then when you look at workplace marijuana use, this is extremely high in legal states. I have another slide that is very new data from Quest Diagnostics that does the testing. It's pretty incredible. Number 3, and this is going to be a huge issue for you, liability wise. Again, honestly, the no side of this campaign, and we haven't really been involved as much for various reasons this time, but the no side of the campaign, frankly, should have made this case to business, to big corporations in New Jersey, because the marijuana lobby has promised to make the workers' right to use pot a priority. And why is that? Well, because depending on how you use, who you are, etc., marijuana can stay in your system for a few days. There's an old myth that it stays 30 days. Honestly, the vast majority of people, it's not 30 days, but it does stay longer than alcohol because it's fat soluble. THC is fat soluble. It stays in your fat, can stay there for usually about a week or 2. The point is, the marijuana lobby hates this because they see this as workplace discrimination for their people. And yet for workplaces, this is tremendously dangerous and risky, especially when you talk about factories or places where they're safety sensitive. And the proposed ballot initiative does nothing to prevent the pot lobby from limiting the scope of workplace drug policies. I mean, let me tell you, if this thing passes and the legislature has to promulgate rules, there's going to be heavy lobbying by the pot lobby to make sure that the workplace is not somewhere where pot users can go after, even if it's dangerous. They're going to set the standard for proving impairment so high, nobody will ever pass. I mean, Cheech and Chong won't be able to pass that standard. I'm serious. And they are just suing the heck out of businesses left and right. And This is just a very, very, very big issue, and I do not think businesses understand what this means for them. First of all, let's move back a little bit. You all know this. Surveys keep telling us the pool of reliable, unskilled labor is way too small. And it's very hard to find someone who can pass a drug screen. I talk to the Roofers Association, to the painters, to the truckers, to lots of these kinds of industries. It's very difficult to hire someone to pass a drug test. This law isn't going to make it any easier to do that. We've seen this coverage in the New York Times where, again, finding these folks is just it's very, very hard. I mean, this was a recent article about as more Americans fail drug tests, employers turn to refugees because they actually use drugs, frankly, way less than citizens do. And it's just a very big issue. And this is the new data I was talking about. Look at these increases. These are all the legal states. We do not see these increases in states where it's illegal. Workplace positivity since legalization, 136% in Oregon, 142% in Nevada, on and on. We are seeing these big increases. These are folks at the workplace testing positive. And by the way, let me just strike down this myth right now. You will not test positive for these kinds of drug tests if you used pot 2 weeks ago. You just won't, because it's not going to be sensitive enough. These are testing for recent use. They are able to do that. It's not exact science, but it's getting better. And also, when you look at impairment behavioral tests, you can combine these with behavioral tests, and you can know pretty quickly if someone's high or not. I mean, that part's not rocket science. But the issue is we're just seeing these huge increases in workplace positivity. In fact, we're just 27% increase in legal states, and actually we should update that. It's even more. The state of Nevada, after being lobbied, they now ban rejecting job applicants over marijuana use. So if you know someone is a regular stoner, I mean, think about it. You're hiring for your factory, and you know someone, or forget about factory, for the front desk of your business, of your small business that you've killed yourself to keep afloat during this time. You cannot reject them in Nevada over marijuana use. Why? Because the pot lobby, when Nevada legalized marijuana in 2016, they worked hard and very hard for years and years and years to do this. And so it's just pretty crazy to see how this is happening. As I mentioned, the marijuana industry has vowed to make employee rights a priority to not use. There's multiple courts now that have looked at this that have said they used to say you can fire for off-the-job use, but now they're changing it. And the founder of NORML said that is not fair. It cannot be allowed to stand. So the courts are weighing in. Massachusetts law protects them. There was actually a New Jersey law as well. Rhode Island court extended protections to a medical marijuana user. Again, what's medical marijuana? Well, for some people, it is needed. For some people, it is end of life. For some people, it improves their life. But for a lot of people, I mean, you have a headache and you qualify for medical marijuana. Let's be honest here. And with this governor expanding medical marijuana like candy, it's not that difficult to qualify. And so now folks are saying, no, I'm a medical user. You can't discriminate against me because I didn't pass a drug test pre-employment. It's pretty crazy. And so this is just an assault on employers. New Mexico, we've seen this happen, again, on and on. And so Colorado, I mean, they're hiring out-of-state employees. The largest construction company said, forget about it. I can't hire Coloradans anymore. They can't pass drug tests. We have seen youth use, especially youth marijuana addiction, go up since legalization. So I'm just shifting gears a little bit here to talk about how this does affect your families and kids. We have seen, there's been a lot of studies, by the way, on youth use. Some have shown no increase, I'm going to be honest. Some have even shown a slight decrease, but the vast majority have shown increases. Again, if we're going to be honest, we have to talk about all the data. And it's going to take years and years and years to collect this data. We have to be science-based, but the vast majority of the studies are showing there are increases. In fact, when you look at Colorado versus national for all of these use levels, Colorado was higher. Look at this, substance use disorder, past month use. This translates to businesses in the workplace. I mean, this is why when people say, well, I only care about youth use. Well, if you're an employer, you should care about everybody using, because, when you have stoned workforce, people who are adults working for you and they're stoned half the time, that's not good for business. That's not going to be good at all. Right now, they're trying to legalize marijuana on the federal level. They have not gotten close, thankfully. We are very concerned about social justice, and I want to be very clear about that because this is being touted as a social justice, push. But the reality is, folks, where are the pot shops going to be? Are they going to be in, the nicer parts of Princeton, or are they going to be in, Camden? I mean, let's be very clear about where they're going to be. Let's be honest. They're going to be the same place that the liquor stores are and the lottery is. And that's why, folks like Ron Rice and Pastor Jethro James and others have really stood up against this, because this isn't about social justice. It's being cloaked as social justice, but Scott's Miracle Grow was never interested. I can't even say it with a straight face. They were never interested in social justice before this became an issue, okay? They're interested in this, and they're giving almost $1 million because of the money they stand to gain. And let's be clear, for a small number of businesses, I mean, we're on a business webinar here, for a small number of businesses, this will be a revenue generator. I mean, they selling marijuana will be their core business. They will make some money. Their hedge fund folks will make money. Their financiers on Wall Street will make money. But for the vast, vast majority of especially small and medium businesses, and I would argue even large businesses that aren't, dealing with marijuana, they're going to suffer as a result of this. And again, I'm scratching my head as to how the business community has not been more engaged. Maybe it's because the governor, really just loves marijuana and pushing it, and so that people don't want to go against the governor. I have heard that from folks in New Jersey. It's very intimidating when you have a governor who's like basically a zealot when it comes to marijuana. Maybe that's why, I don't know, but I'm just very surprised there hasn't been more of a pushback. I invite you to go on our website, which is learnaboutsam.org. I'll have that URL here. I invite you to go on and look at our report. It's on the homepage, Lessons Learned from State Marijuana Legalization. And there's, 100 plus pages on what we've learned, because it's been, 8 years since Colorado's done it. This has been a good amount of time. We're not going to know for 20 or 30 years, I think, the full impact at least. But it has. We do have some. We do know something on it now. If you want to read something longer, when I left the Obama administration, I wrote a book called Reefer Sanity: 7 Great Myths About Marijuana. The foreword is by Patrick Kennedy, who, of course, again, is a New Jersey resident now. And I talk about the myths. There's so many myths out there, like this is going to be a windfall of money for the state and it's going to lower your taxes. If only that were the case. States that have legalized marijuana are all doing deficit spending. They're all in debt. This is not saving their budgets. It's a drop in the bucket. I mean, Illinois the other day had a press release. I mean, it's amazing they spent time. They had a press release saying they have $100 million in revenue now from pot since they've legalized. Their entire budget is $50 billion with a B. This is a drop in the bucket, and they're not counting the costs. I mean, what about the cost of the drug to drivers? What about the workplace costs? What about the cost of kids dropping out of school? I mean, the mental health costs, the treatment cost. They're not even counting the costs, let alone the administrative costs, by the way, because there are a lot of administrative costs. This isn't lowering anybody's taxes. But again, it's a great talking point that a lot of folks like to use. Again, learnaboutsam.org. If you want to email me, we can send more information, info@learnaboutsam.org. Again, learnaboutsam.org is our website. And again, I'll just kind of say here as I stop sharing my screen, I think we're just at a time right now in our country where this is very popular, and we're kind of on an up, going up in terms of the popularity of marijuana and the normalization of it. But I don't know if it's going to take 20, 30, or 50, maybe 100 years. At some point, we're going to wake up from this like we woke up from cigarettes. I mean, people don't smoke. If somebody smokes in a restaurant right now, they get thrown out, maybe arrested. You can't smoke on airplanes anymore. You certainly can't smoke in hospitals like you used to be able to. That norm changed. It changed after a lot of people died, and we exposed the tobacco industry for what it was. I think that's going to happen with marijuana. There's no reason why it wouldn't. Marijuana In fact, fewer people are familiar with the smell. More people dislike the smell. It's a huge nuisance if you're a business or an apartment. I mean, if you're a landlord, we didn't even talk about landlords. If you're a landlord, this is an incredible nuisance for a number of reasons. I think there will be a turnaround at some point. I don't know when that will be. I think we're in for a lot more normalization before there is a turnaround. But at some point, we're going to say, maybe this isn't exactly what we had bargained for. And frankly, and I'll just end on this, and then I really want to take questions. It's very different than something like alcohol. And you hear that comparison a lot because, frankly, it polls very well. We've seen the polling from the pro side. They love making the alcohol comparison because if you say, well, alcohol is legal, and boy, we've seen alcoholics, it's a terrible thing. So, why wouldn't we make marijuana legal? There's a couple of problems with that logic. Number one, the last time I checked, two wrongs don't make a right. I mean, alcohol is legal, not because it's good for you. Alcohol is legal because of its cultural place in Western civilization for the last, 3,000 years. I mean, if you think about it, it's been used by the majority of Western civilization for about that long. It's incredible. So it has a rich cultural history, but we pay the price for it. I mean, alcohol is connected to so many, problems in terms of, crime and domestic violence, et cetera. We pay the price because a lot of alcohol's problems, they don't stem from the person drinking a little beer now and then. They stem from the small number of users who consume the vast majority of the product. And that is the same thing I think we're seeing with marijuana. But again, alcohol is in and out of your system in 24 hours. Marijuana isn't. It stays there a little bit longer. I think, again, when people compare it, I sort of say, well, if my headlights are broken, I don't want to break my tail lights too. I mean, that, if my headlights are broken, let's fix them. Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, right? I mean, so I think we need to slow this train down a little bit and really think about what these impacts are. I've only had 15 minutes to present a few impacts for you, but there are numerous. And if you go to our website, you will see those business impacts. I think we're in for a lot of lawsuits. I think this is going to be great for litigators, and I think it's going to be very, very bad for business. So I would urge you to think twice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sabet. A couple questions. Actually, first is coming from our audience, but it is more of an observation, but I'd like your comment on it. So read it, and then I'll ask for your reaction.
Sure.
An observation rather than a question. If the ballot question passes, using pot will be constitutionally protected. Consequently, municipalities may not have the right to keep pot shops out. The constitutional amendment, unlike the bill that failed, does not provide this protection to towns. Your thoughts?
It's a very, very good point. And so I think it's going to be caught up in the courts. And I think it's going to be very difficult for localities, you're right, to overcome that. I do think that there are still those bans in place. They will be challenged eventually. It's going to be caught up in the courts. But the point is well made. This is a constitutional amendment. I mean, marijuana in the Constitution, I mean, that's bizarre. It's like, do we want to put, I don't know, parking ticket policy in the Constitution? I mean, that's less, serious. And so it doesn't make sense. But again, it's a very smart, I think, ploy from the pro side to do that. It's going to cause a lot of problems.
And then just, moving from the policy to the practical. All right, this passes. What next? What advice can you offer to our businesses in terms of how they prepare for this?
Yeah, well, I think you should have workplace policies in place that talk about, no drugs and random drug tests if you need to do that. There are a lot of resources out there to help you do that, but and we're happy to be a resource as well, but you need to have those policies in place. And it's going to be a very, very difficult environment. It really is.
You talked about smoking and the scent, the smell, etc. We also know a lot of this has to do with edibles, but the smoking, isn't it, where you have no smoking zones, very limited where you can smoke in public places.
Yeah.
I just assume, you can't smoke a cigarette, you can't smoke pot. I mean, that's going to be the same in any public place as exists now, correct?
You would assume that, but again, I think everything is on the table for the pot lobby. There's a ton of money for them to make. They're going to challenge every single law possible. I've seen places in Colorado where there's no smoking of cigarettes, but they do allow marijuana. So it's crazy, but they will be pushing the envelope on everything. I mean, they've made wild claims about how marijuana gets people off opioids, which actually almost all the literature that's serious on this shows the opposite of that. It actually exacerbates the use of opioids. It does not substitute. So my point is, if they're going to make that claim, they're going to make all kinds of claims. They're really going to push the envelope.
I actually want to stay on that medical question because you did use the term addiction earlier.
Yeah.
You used the word addiction, and we hear all the time that you can't get addicted to marijuana. So addiction versus use from the medical perspective, and then the practical. What's really, is it semantics or, you know?
Well, there's a very big difference. I mean, an addiction to marijuana is what we call in science cannabis use disorder. It's an actual term that the DSM has acknowledged. You know, this is probably one of the big myths about marijuana, is that it's not addictive. And it's always the people, you know, I give talks all around the world, really. And, you know, I have people come up to me and they say, well, I know marijuana is not addictive. And I should know because I use it every single day. You know, so that's kind of the logic that we sometimes hear. The bottom line is there is a cannabis use disorder. It is defined by heavy withdrawal. It's defined by intolerance. It's defined by both physical and psychological symptoms. Very heavy psychological symptoms often. And I wish people could read the emails I get from parents almost every single day about their kids who are 15 years old. They started with Juul, then they moved on to THC vaporizing. They're addicted. They can't stop. They're claiming it's medical. I mean, the whole thing is a mess. And this is an accepted term, except often many corners of the marijuana lobby, most corners, want to ignore that, just like big tobacco ignored cigarette and nicotine addiction for decades. And I keep mentioning big tobacco for a reason. The people who stand to make money off of marijuana, it's actually big tobacco, big alcohol, and big pharma. They're the three biggest investors in marijuana right now with all the financial companies, because they see this as an alternative product line. All the major beverage manufacturers now have a marijuana related drink that they're either developing or they've already developed. I mean, if we think this is about mom and pop and Cheech and Chong and, you know, flower children from San Francisco, we don't understand it. This is about the major business, corporate, institutional, multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporations that are pursuing this because it's very big money for them. And they deny that marijuana is addictive, even though that's not a controversial statement in science at all.
So one last question with a minute to go. The whole idea of the black market going away or not, were we to legalize this and then perhaps overtax it to generate revenue back to our budget, what thoughts do you have on that?
No, it's a great question. I didn't include that slide in this because of time. The black market is thriving in every state that's legalized marijuana. I mean, let's think about it. If you are a drug dealer and you have a great business, are you going to be saying, oh, well, okay, I'm going to go to dental school now, you know, forget about it. They legalize it. I'm done. No, you adapt. And so what folks have done is basically, like you said, Michelle, undercut the legal price, because it's always taxed at a pretty, you know, hefty tax, undercut the legal price, and they can make a ton of money by doing so. People continue to do that. Obviously, there will be some people and a lot of people who go to the, you know, legal market as well, but you're expanding the market. You're not substituting the market. And you know, we have seen a thriving underground market in all of these states that have done this. Big cartels. We've seen the, you know, foreign cartels, domestic cartels having to do with it. They don't go away. And again, it's just another one of these kind of, you know, sort of theoretical talking points like, well, if we legalized it, we could get rid of we won't have the black market making money. No, you have both people making money. You have the dealers and the cartels on the one hand, and then you have the multi-billion-dollar corporations who, by the way, then start legally funding politicians on all levels, the corruption. I mean, look at the corruption on the local level in California, these different city councils and stuff. They take money for these licenses. Illinois now, I mean, you have a former marijuana commissioner who was just recently a commissioner, now is a license holder. You know, I mean, maybe here in New Jersey we'll be completely free of corruption and there will be absolutely no dipping and there will be zero corruption in this great state of New Jersey. I hope that's the case and New Jersey can be a model. But boy, that's a very high bar to go over because we haven't seen any state avoid that.
Yeah, I appreciate your observations this morning. We are out of time for your session, but thank you for helping again, to inform from that side from which you bring information. We appreciate that so much this morning. Thank you, Dr. Sabet.
Sure. Well, thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much.
Please keep the questions coming. I see a few more coming in. We will get to those through the program. But now it is my pleasure to introduce Fruquan Muzan, who will lead a panel discussion, and he will introduce his panelists. But first, let me introduce Fruquan. Fruquan is a partner with McElroy Deutsch. Sorry, let me start that again. McElroy Deutsch, Mulvaney, and Carpenter. He's the former assistant counsel to Governor Corzine, a former partner at Gibbons PC, and he spent 4 years as general counsel to the Senate Majority Office, where he was instrumental in drafting, developing, and in the evolution of cannabis legalization for adult use, as well as the expansion of the medical cannabis program. He's the current chair and founder of the Cannabis Law Practice Group at his firm, and he is, as I understand and have come to know, an all-around great and funny guy. So please, let's welcome Fruquan Muzan, who is going to introduce his panelists now.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome to everyone joining this panel, this discussion. I thought Dr. Sabet did a great job explaining his side of things, and I think this panel is going to be very informative. It's going to be interesting, perhaps a little entertaining as well. You have experts from all sides of it. You have people like me that provide legal services to the cannabis practice area, to industry, consultants, advisors, and stuff like that. And also, we have someone who is a industry participant as well. So without further ado, I would like each panelist to log on and tell us a little something about yourself. Ruth?
Sure, thank you, Fruquan. And first, thank you, NJBIA, for putting this on. It's a great topic, and education is always really key when we're talking about voting, particularly now. My name is Ruth Rauls. I am a partner at Saul, Ewing, Arnstein, and Lehr. I am a member of the firm's Cannabis Law Practice Group. I have been with the firm for about 13 years. I grew up as a litigator. My practice has primarily focused on labor and employment work. And I always tell folks that I fell into the cannabis space accidentally because I started fielding a lot of phone calls from clients asking me what to do when they have an employee with a positive drug test for cannabis, and they hand them this card that says that they're allowed to use it. What are they supposed to do? Those calls have become more frequent as we've seen a lot of states take action on medical cannabis and adult use. So marrying that experience in my employment practice with some of the regulatory experience that I have through employment work really goes well, particularly in New Jersey as the program is expanding. Our practice group does a lot of MMA work and other types of issues, but I really do focus on the employment side. So I'm interested to talk about some employment issues, especially hearing some of the things that were just said and kind of discussing how those have affected clients that I have dealt with. And thank you all for having me here.
Thank you. We're looking forward to hearing about that. Next up is Hugh O'Byrne. Hugh?
Hi, Fruquan, Ruth, so good to see you guys. So my name is Hugh O'Byrne. I am a lawyer and a consultant and a participant in the cannabis industry. I'm currently also a director of the Cannabis Advisory Group, which is a policy-focused, not-for-profit organization that is seeking to try and uncover the best practices of the how of cannabis legal access, whether it be medical or adult use, with a particular focus on New Jersey and the Mid-Atlantic states. Prior to my role with as a director with the Cannabis Advocacy Group, I was the president of the New Jersey Cannabis Industry Association. My experience in the cannabis industry dates to 2016, but my experience in cannabis advocacy dates to 1989.
Wow, 1989.
Yeah.
Thank you. And lastly, Evan, like to come on and introduce yourself.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me on. My name is Evan Kolakowski. I am the Director of Regulatory and Quality Assurance for TerrAscend, New Jersey, one of the northern permittees in the state of New Jersey for the medical cannabis program. I have been in the cannabis industry for roughly 9 years. Started off with the New Jersey medical marijuana program around 2012, where I helped develop the program, build it from the ground up, from the patient base, physician base, law enforcement outreach, and ultimately the field monitoring of dispensaries and grower processors in the state. From there, I went to New York to work for a private company, opening an extraction laboratory, grow space, and 3 dispensaries. And then after that, moved down to Maryland, where I helped open the largest cannabis greenhouse in the state, where I operated there for a couple of years. Now I find myself back in New Jersey for good, done moving around, and helping Terrace and NJ develop an organization that runs on safe and efficient processes in providing patients with quality medicine.
Thank you, Evan. So you say you have a political insider, a cannabis law expert, a cannabis founder from 1989 who's been involved, and an actual practitioner in the business. What else can you ask? So let's get started with some questions. Now we heard from Dr. Sabet, and opponents of cannabis legalization, like him, have cited what I think 3 main concerns. First and foremost is access to children. Secondly is the safety of the roads. And thirdly, which you didn't mention, which I expected to hear, this idea that cannabis is a gateway drug to heart. Would each of you like to speak on how you allay any concerns people have? Ruth, you first.
Sure, I'll go first. I think I approach those concerns the same way I approach a lot of concerns when I hear my clients talking about the employee side is the sky is not falling. So let's all take a beat and let's take a breath and think about, what we're actually dealing with. So, I don't have the policy background and some of the scientific background here, but, as a lawyer, I like 2 things. I like facts and I like rules. So I like to look at what data we have and how the rules that we have can impact what that data looks like ultimately. I think here, the fact that New Jersey is not the first is a good thing. We have a lot of states that we can look at. We have a lot of petri dishes out there that started this from scratch. They've made mistakes, they've made missteps, and they've corrected. So I think it's helpful when we're talking about these concerns to look at what those states have done, see what's worked, see what hasn't worked, and use the same tools that we have always had available to us, that we still have available to us, to figure out how to work those problems. Is it through rule? Is it through regulation? Is it through guidance? How do we deal with that? So when looking at that data, looking at what comes out, and seeing how those states have addressed the issues, I think is really educational and helpful, particularly for lawmakers here. Because here, just to keep in mind, this is a ballot initiative, right? This is not legislation. This is not a regulation yet. The legislature is going to do that. The CRC is going to do that. And they're going to take that stuff into account. So using that language and crafting it and sharpening those tools, maybe in a different way, can still allow us to deal with some of these problems. So I just approach it more holistically and say, let's look at them specifically. Let's look at what the data actually shows, and let's look at the ways that other states have used regulations, law enforcement, what have you, to address those concerns as we go into this process.
Thanks. Hugh, what do you think?
I think on the youth increase in accessibility or in use by the youth of cannabis with some interesting data, and I guess data can be argued about, and it's not always completely dispositive. But on this one, I'm looking at data from the Centers for Disease Control. I'm looking at it from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for 2020, 2019. In the Republican-controlled Trump administration period, saying that, look, since 2013, both alcohol and lifetime cannabis use has been dropping among the youth nationwide. So, to just say, there's very clear that that's the case. There's been a rise. I mean, it's contradicted even by our federal organs of watching these things. So I think it's very encouraging, the data that the youth are actually not having. And then we should also keep in mind that youth accessibility from a legal and enforcement point of view, will remain unchanged with regulation, because the regulation of cannabis does not contemplate allowing the youth to have it. So just like today, the youth will be, policed and educated about not engaging with the substance, much like it is with alcohol. On the driving side of things, this is an area where we need to be honest generally, whereas we see that in medical cannabis context, there doesn't seem to be a movement of the needle with respect to fatalities. There is some evidence, however, with adult use that traffic fatality has increased, and that is something that has to be balanced. And of course, like anything that we're looking to do with respect to bringing something out of criminality and into regulation, there is always a cost-benefit analysis. And of all the things that I can see that there's seemingly a consensus of concern about, it is with respect to a slight increase in traffic fatalities, particularly that have been reported in Washington and Colorado. There are, however, great technological strides being made with respect to being able to test for roadside tests, not unlike which don't exist just yet for cannabis, but that do exist for alcohol, which will help with policing of the situation. And also, police are getting their heads around it a lot more as to what to do about it. And quite frankly, some of these states prior to the legalization of cannabis never really either had been looking for the data properly before, and they admit this. They say, I wish we looked like we do now prior to adult use. So that, being a little bit behind has led to a situation there. And then finally, the gateway situation, I mean, that's just bizarre, and I think it's been dropped by the wayside. I mean, there isn't anything biologically in cannabis that leads you into opiate use or leads you into stimulant use. There's nothing specifically about that. I mean, some people may be addicted. Addiction's very complicated. Obsessive. A lot of features are involved in, like obsessive compulsive disorders, etc., that can impact certain types of excessive use by very, very small numbers of people, like there is with people that cut themselves that have or have other types of obsessive compulsions. However, I think the good news here is that the regulation of cannabis at least purports, and I think has some good effects. If we are moving, and over time there is a secular shift away from the black market as states open up and as prices make more sense, away from black market activity to, and at least providing an alternative in the regulated market, we reduce the gateway market effect. I mean, cannabis itself is not a gateway drug, but it is being bound up in the shadows of an an inability to police this situation away. What we see is the people that supply cannabis illegally don't tend to, a significant portion of them supply other things, right? So you're dealing with someone that is selling you cannabis, but will more than happily sell you something more nefarious. So a hope for regulations that we're reducing the access to these other more dangerous drugs and reducing the interface with people that are trying to sell those things.
And that's what I've heard the biggest argument against decriminalization, is that if you decriminalize, then you pretty much make 100% black market and an expansion of that market, and it'll make it easier for drugs to be a gateway because the person has to go to a dealer where they can not only get cannabis gummies, but they can also get anything they want. So that's
exactly
the argument I've heard. As far as the other things, I've always told people that as this comes up, the legalization of cannabis to people under 21 is not being talked about. That's not a part of it. You're not allowed to drive while under the influence of cannabis. So we aren't changing those things. But I do think, as you alluded to, we have to get better at trying to curtail the use in driving on cannabis, because there's no actual testing. People like to have the breathalyzer, but at the same time, you don't have a breathalyzer for a lot of things that can make you impaired to drive. A lot of legal drugs, not getting enough sleep. So I think the officers need to be trained more on determining, when to pull someone over for swerving or driving too slowly. Evan, what do you think? How do you keep the cannabis out of the hands of children?
Yeah, so first off, I think from an operator standpoint, just as it stands today, with the alternative treatment centers in New Jersey who dispense medical cannabis products to qualifying patients. In a legal market, if these entities, such as TerrAscend New Jersey and the other ones throughout the state, are the same entities who are going to be dispensing cannabis on an adult use market, the access control limitations are so strict. We have very little wiggle room as far as our dispensaries are allowed to even let people into the building. Even patients who do have cards who are qualifying have to go through multiple verification steps to walk through our dispensaries and walk into an alternative treatment center. So just as far from a minor being able to access cannabis from a retail facility, it would be incredibly difficult on a regulatory level and an operational level.
What about after the cannabis gets in the house? Like Senator Sweeney wanted to make it illegal to sell gummies or to sell anything that looks like candy. And I have gone to a legal dispensary in Vegas and had a gummy, and my first thought was, this tastes way too good. It tastes like a gummy. So what is your reaction to the belief that perhaps we shouldn't have gummies or anything that looks like candy? So,
I think first off, it comes down to education of the people who are purchasing it. So all the alternative treatment centers now throughout the state are doing a great job in educating the people who are purchasing products, and also the strict limitations behind the products that we're allowed to develop right now. So you use gummies as an example. Anything that gets approved in the state goes through rigorous rounds of submissions and approvals. It takes months and months and months to get a product approved. Even the new Jay Koenig law has certain allowabilities to what we're allowed to produce. So just I really think it comes down to the accessibility of a regulatory level and the education of the people who are purchasing it.
thanks a lot. Let me pivot a little. This is the New Jersey Business and Industry Association. So we have a lot of business owners that are listening in. And we heard from Captain Sabet, there are business owners that are concerned about how to deal with weed smoking employees. Now, as Kevin mentioned, and he is correct on this observation, that the current law with dealing with medical cannabis and the draft legislation for adult use that will be enacted if the ballot question passed, does have significant protections for the employees that want to partake. Ruth, can you tell employers what are their current obligations under the law, and how will that change if adult use comes?
Sure, thank you. So I'll give a lawyer answer on the adult use. It depends. Again, this is a ballot initiative, right? So it's the devil's in the details of what the statute is going to look like when it ultimately gets passed in the regs on the adult use side. But we can look to the Jay Koenig law, which does have language in it. So let's talk about what that says. What that says, and when the initial law and a lot of the initial laws that throughout the United States didn't really address this employment issue for whatever reason, maybe people weren't thinking about at the time, but they have addressed it, they've updated, they've changed a lot of those laws. So what the law says right now is that it's unlawful to take an adverse employment action against an employee who is a registered qualifying patient based solely on the employee's status as a registrant with the commission. The statute also bakes into it somewhat of an accommodation / interactive process analysis. And I'm going to just take a step back on this point. When we're looking at employee protections and the cases and the lawsuits that deal with medical cannabis use and employees, it falls into two buckets. To get a recommendation for a medical to use medical cannabis, you have to have a debilitating condition, an underlying medical condition, a qualifying condition, whatever phrase we want to use under those statutes. Almost every single one of those, depending on what state you are and in New Jersey, is going to qualify as a disability. And you are receiving a medical product to treat an underlying disability. So the employee has both two types of claims that they assert. One, a discrimination claim. You, employer, are discriminating against me because I have a disability and I am using a state authorized treatment to treat that disability. And you can't do that. You cannot take an adverse employment action against me because of that. The second is if you have a state authorizing statute like the Jay Koenig law, which has express anti-discrimination provisions in it, which says what I just read, you can't take an adverse employment action against me solely because I'm a registered user. So when we're talking about the medical context, we are talking about underlying health conditions, we are talking about disabilities, and that's the basis for these discrimination claims. But what else does the J. Koenig law say? Something really, really important that it says that goes to employment issues is that nothing in this act shall be deemed to restrict an employer's ability to prohibit or take adverse employment action for the possession or use of intoxicating substances during work hours or on premises of the workplace or on the workplace outside of work hours, or if someone's impaired. It also has an exception for that puts your federal funding at risk, which I can talk a little bit more later. So there are exceptions built in to the J. Koenig law, which say very clearly, yes, you cannot discriminate against someone simply because they are a medical card holder. However, you are not required to permit people to have product on site, to use cannabis on site, to come to work impaired, and the law is very clear on that. I would imagine we probably see similar language in any type of adult use legislation. Again, we'll have to wait till that comes out. I want to talk just briefly about drug testing. The issue for employers on drug testing is that there is no acute intoxication test for marijuana cannabis. So meaning it's not like alcohol, I can't give you a breathalyzer and find out if you're impaired. But that doesn't mean that I don't have the same tools available to me as an employer to determine if an employee is impaired. You know, I've been at this for a while and dealing with employers for a while. There are a lot of prescription medications that folks take that can impair them and make them unable to do their job. And they have an obligation to disclose that to us as an employer so that we can either move them, make an accommodation, or do something. But what we don't have to do is allow an individual to work impaired. And there's nothing that's in the J. Koenig law or any of the cases that have come out under the medical marijuana statutes that require an employer to allow an employee to work impaired or to even utilize product on site. You know, and what some states have done in preparation, I think, for adult use or that have adult use, they've essentially banned pre-employment drug testing. We've seen it in Nevada. They passed a statute banning pre-employment drug testing for THC. There are a ton of exceptions to that law, particularly if we're dealing with safety sensitive positions. I believe that there's some other childcare type exceptions in there. CBA exceptions, collective bargaining agreements for the non-employment lawyers on the phone. So, you know, there are a lot of exceptions built into those laws. We've seen New York City pass an ordinance that bans pre-employment drug testing for cannabis. And I want to talk I heard a comment earlier and at the beginning about how employers are unable to find employees that can pass a drug test, so they're looking out other places to hire. You know, what I've experienced in terms of the folks that I'm talking to, and I just spoke, back when we could travel and speak, I spoke with the Retail Industry Leaders Association, which really comprises a lot of big box stores. And a lot of those stores are obviously located in states that have adult use or very robust medical marijuana programs. And the response I get isn't that they've looked outside of their typical workforce to hire. It's that, well, we just dropped THC from our testing panel. We don't test for it anymore. And that's essentially what's been codified in the New York City ordinance, and that's what Nevada has done. So we could potentially see action in New Jersey that basically just says, look, you can't test for it anymore for a pre-employment drug test. But what it doesn't say is that, you know, you can't test if you think someone's impaired. So if someone you believe is at work that is impaired, you could still test for that. You would have to match up the presence, though, with the signs of impairment. So there's a case out of Arizona, the Walmart case. It had a whole bunch of stuff in it. It's a long decision. It's a great decision to read and really get some analysis of these issues. But one of the fundamental principles that came out of that was that presence does not equal impairment. And what the court said was, look, you had a positive drug test for THC, but you have no other indicia that this person was impaired at the time of this workplace accident. And without that, we can't make that correlation. We can't say those two things go together. So going back to kind of one of the original points I mentioned, we do have tools, and the employers always have tools to recognize impairment. We've done it with alcohol. We have a test for that. Great. We've done it with prescription drug use and any other type of issues that are out there. But you have to couple that with making sure that we recognize and see issues of impairment, that we document that, and that we can take action on it. And I just want to talk for a second about some of the employment cases that are out there. I think the Barbudo decision was mentioned. There's a case out of Connecticut, the District of Connecticut, Knopfsinger. There's the Wild case in New Jersey. There's the Walmart case I talked about. Every single one of those cases, and most of the cases where you see a finding in favor of a plaintiff, there's very clear language in that decision that the plaintiff, the use was disclosed, meaning I've shown that person my card, I disclosed that this is what I was doing. The plaintiff has certified or testified under oath in some form of proceeding as the case went forward that they did not consume cannabis at work and that they did not come to work under the influence. And those are key factors in most of those decisions. And there's a recent case that just came out in the District of New Jersey. I believe it was just in September, on September 15th. And I think it illustrates that point with respect to the disclosure and having approval to use it and in terms of what the issues were. And in that case, the plaintiff had asserted claims under LAD for a positive THC test. The plaintiff in that case, I don't believe, had a card. They hadn't disclosed it, and they were self-treating, and they did not uphold those claims. The court granted summary judgment in favor of the defendant employer based on some of those facts. So these cases are fact-specific, and it really deals with whether or not, if you're going to take an action for someone that's impaired, you have to demonstrate they were impaired, and then also that if someone is using cannabis for medical purpose, typically that language results only to offsite use, and they can't come to work impaired. And most of the statutes, including New Jersey's, has that prefatory language in it. So I would expect to see that same type of language in any type of adult use legislation that comes out of the legislature, but we'll see what happens.
Now, you talked about pre-employment and you talked about testing someone that you suspect is impaired. But what about everyone else? I'm an employer, I have 25 people working for me, and I'm concerned about productivity, I'm concerned about safety, and I want to give random drug tests every Friday at 2 o'clock. What is your advice for me?
I would say a drug test every Friday at 2 o'clock is not random, but
well, people are random.
I'll say, I'm going to give a general answer. Random drug testing, it's a very specific policy. You need to be careful about how you implement it. There's a lot of case law in New Jersey about when and how you can do that. The thing about random drug testing that I would say is can create problems is it really random? Are you selectively drug testing folks that are in certain demographic areas or have certain attributes or characteristics and subjecting them to a drug test? And is there a disparate impact on your workforce? There have been cases out about that. So random drug testing is tricky, and I think you have to be careful how you use it. I will say, with respect to drug testing, the Knopfsinger case that came out of the District of Connecticut actually dealt with a federal contractor. And they tried to rely on the Drug-Free Workplace Act to say, look, we can drug test everybody. That's what we get to do under the Drug-Free Workplace Act. And what the court said is, no, that's not what the Drug-Free Workplace Act says. It just says you have an obligation to have a drug-free workplace. It doesn't mean you have an obligation to drug test. So I think when we're talking about drug testing, you have to look at why you're doing it. Is it helping you? Are you utilizing it in a way that's equal to everyone that's working for you? And are you applying that policy across the board to everyone the same?
Thank you for that. That's very informative. You, got a question for you. The last I checked the medical program, they said there's about 80,000 patients, somewhere around there. Every time I check, the number's high. What do you expect the number to grow to with the adult use ballot question passes? And what happens to the medical program if the adult use ballot question?
Okay, so two parts, two-part question, and the thing that I think would focus on initially is like, how do you go about trying to project the adult use market? So there's a few things that we need to assume. Let's just assume that New Jersey is the only adult use state in the Mid-Atlantic, and that New York and Pennsylvania aren't, because right now we are talking about a ballot initiative and nothing specifically is going on in those two states. So let's start with that. the medical program is kind of easier to understand because you have a historical track record of how many people are signing on, and you get to see every one of your consumers because they have to register. In an adult use context, that's not the case. It's any adult over 21. So to try and figure that out, I think the way that some really great thinkers over at Vincenti Soderbergh Strategies had told me way back when we looked at the map was you say, let's take a center point in New Jersey, Princeton, for instance, and let's do every adult, everyone over 21 within a 2-hour drive of Princeton. So that covers all of the state plus a reasonable distance in our neighboring states. That number yields about 28 million potential consumers. And then you say, okay, well, how many of those adults are going to be purchasing? So then the best thing to look at, I think, is the DEA consumption rates for cannabis, which is, the DEA, that it's irrespective of regulations. What they think that the habitual user, habitual consumer of cannabis in the Mid-Atlantic is about 11% of the population. So let's say 11% of 28 million, you could be as high or higher than 3 million people purchasing on a fairly regular basis. So that's startling and staggering. There is a potential that New Jersey, as an adult use state, will be for a time, and certainly by a per square mile basis, the biggest cannabis market on earth. What will, that will change when the other states come online and they adopt adult use as well. It'll go down a little bit because there'll be less travel from out of state. But what we've seen in Massachusetts and then in Illinois, the shift from medical cannabis to adult use cannabis, particularly in Illinois, where it was executed more effectively, but even in Massachusetts, has been staggering numbers, staggering changes that have occurred as far as consumer demand goes. And we have probably significant reason to believe that we're going to even have a larger demand impacting our state than we have seen in either Massachusetts to date or Illinois. The Western states are bigger. Most of them are smaller, California being the outsized number there. But California is massive, right? Geographically, it's huge. And its population is much bigger. But if you just take California alone, I guess it's like maybe getting close to 40 million people, over 35 million people in California. Well, if you look at what's right around New Jersey, given the density of the Mid-Atlantic, we're not far off. We're also not far off of Canada. So it's a little potentially, you can never know for sure. And there are many factors that go into whether or not, how it's going to unroll. The unrolling of it does have an impact on this. Are we prepared? Things like that. But it's fairly, it's potentially staggering, the difference. And so the next question is a really great question. Because we have seen in Western states, the medical programs sort of get obliterated or just get lost. Like, you take a drop of water and pour it into the ocean. And what happens to that drop of water? Do producers continue to cultivate for cultivars or for cannabis strains that are particularly beneficial for medical, as opposed to just moving where the vast majority of the demand will go? Our state's way out ahead of that. I'm very, very delighted to say our state has taken a very, very serious approach to maintaining the integrity of the medical cannabis program. And the last time we had an adult use bill, I think that it's going to be under pressure. And if we do it right, I think we'll see. I don't know if we'll continue to see a lot of growth in the medical program, but I don't think we'll see it being eradicated. I mean, things that can be done will be, obviously reducing tax burden, making things less costly, allowing for and encouraging certain types of more medically focused product and to be available to medical patients, encouraging and creating regulations where medical patients' access is fronted or comes before adult use consumers if they're in the same dispensary. There's no doubt the medical program will be under pressure because many people just won't go through the motion of getting a medical card when they can buy in the adult use market. The way to combat that is to provide the proper amount of incentives, then the proper amount of education. And our state also really has contemplated integrating the medical cannabis program and cannabis just generally into our broader ecosystem of academia, research, et cetera. So there's a lot that our state wants to see our academic institutions involved in cannabis, thinking about it, publishing about it, studying it, and feeding back to our regulators and to our population, and hopefully that'll benefit and maintain the integrity of the medical program as under the extreme stress that a massive consumer market will have for it.
Well, let's ask our expert. Evan over here is actually serving the medical cannabis community now. How do you think the adult use passage of the ballot question will affect medical?
So it's definitely going to be interesting, and I think kind of to go say to what Hugh said, I really do think that the integrity and the way that the medical program has been structured so far does support the availability of this program to work its way into an adult use market in the right way. New Jersey's medical market's been running since I think 2010. And through that time, they've created a pretty effective program to where I think with a massive expansion like the adult use market, while there will be some tremendous pressure on the medical market, I think it will be an effective means.
Well, now under the medical program, like you can get these books and they'll say, well, if you have a headache, this strain will help better. And if you have Tourette's, this strain will help better. And there's a lot of research going on which ailment it corresponds to the best type of, treatment. So I'm wondering if you're concerned that if adult use becomes legal and everyone could just come into the dispensary, is that development of medical program going to decrease the research? What do you think?
Well, I mean, just to hop on, just a comment about how you're explaining about products. So there's a myriad of different products out on the market across the nation. Some are developed for medical uses. Some are developed more for recreational and adult uses. So you have formulated products that are specifically designed for patients who suffer from certain kinds of debilitating medical conditions. That certainly gives the incentive for people to stay on board with the medical program, because it gives them access to products that would allow them to use and access essentially medicine that helps them with their debilitating medical condition. And on the other side, you have products that could be developed that are solely for the adult use market.
Thanks. Let's talk about money for a second. When talking about legal cannabis, we're always talking about economic justice and social justice and freedom, but very little discussion about how much revenue we can actually expect. Now, I saw a study a few years ago that predicted $300-something million of yearly tax revenue. But you open the study and it assumes that everyone now that currently partakes in cannabis is going to leave their current supplier. They're going to walk into a store, show their ID, and pay 25% tax. Nowhere in the world is that happening. I think it's safe to assume that there's going to be at least some illegal black market for all time, I would say. So I think that $300 million number is too high. What do you guys think? What's a realistic revenue generating goal?
Who should go?
I'm going to ask you since you chimed in.
It's really hard. The other thing is the tax rate in the constitutional language that's involved with the ballot initiative is significantly lower than 25%.
Yes.
I believe it's the sales tax rate with potential, and I know there's wiggle room around, maybe there's other ways to come up with excise taxes or something like that. A lot has to do with what is the right tax rate. And then depending on where the tax rate comes out, I don't think we would, and if we roll things out with enough supply properly, we strike the right balance between too high a tax rate and you end up incentivizing black market activity. But too low a tax rate. Obviously, the more you lower the tax rate, the less returns you're going to have. But I would suspect that we would come in done right, come in right around Illinois or a little bit more, 100 million, maybe 100, 120 million. There's a lot of TBD in order to try and figure that out, as far as I can tell.
Sure. What do you think, Ruth? Given any thought to that?
I keep saying, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see. And I think, again, the devil's going to be in the details on how it's taxed and what kind of revenue comes out of that. A major concern, I think, that always floats around with respect to taxes is, oh, that's great. We have this new product. Let's tax it. That's great revenue. But here, I think the counterbalance to that is you have a product that does have a black market involved, that does have illegal sales involved. And you have to balance, what that tax revenue is, what's too much that you're going to get rid of that market. And I think that that's been a challenge in some of the states that have programs like this in finding that balance. So, it is a new source of tax revenue, but I think, how the tax rate gets set and actually how it plays out, it's hard to say. I think it's going to be an interesting question, but there's a lot of thought going into how to set that tax to make sure the industry thrives and you put out of business a whole nother black market that's surrounding it, which is part of the goal here and a lot of the talk that's being had.
I think putting the black market out of business completely is unrealistic. But I do remember from economics 101 class back in 1980, whatever it was, where you enter into an industry and there's like a chart. And the higher your price, the lower the amount of market share you're going to get. But because it's a higher price, you get a bigger number anyway, right? So you get 10% of the market at 5% tax rate, but then you get, a bigger market as you lower it, but then you're getting less money because you lowered it. So it's kind of interesting. I actually think initially, if you guys may remember, the legal marijuana legislation had a tax rate that would be adjusted. You remember that, Hugh? It started at
I thought it was awesome. The way they came out to figure out the state tax, I thought was super intelligent. I thought it was better than any other state in that the way it was originally done.
Right. There was a number in there like after a year we're going to check and see how we're doing, and then we're going to be able to raise it if we're doing well. We'll be able to lower it if we're not. So there's enabling legislation that people are looking at now. So if the ballot question passes, the legislature is going to have to pass a bill that's going to look very similar to the way it looked back in 2019, but with some adjustments that people like us can try and get in there and see if we can help them. Now, my question is, what keeps you up at night, assuming the ballot question passes, assuming that there's enabling legislation that does what we promised, economic justice, social justice, revenue, what most concerns you going forward about reaching our goals?
Me?
Yeah.
So I think what I am really delighted by nothing's perfect, but our political process really drove forth some really good legislation. And I think our regulatory heart's in the right place as well. So in a lot of states, the problem is more with the people holding the legal and regulatory pen. I'm not so worried about that because I think our state has demonstrated, and this is hard stuff, like some really progressive stuff and an appetite to figure out how to do things right. And we will, I hope, there are rooms for improvement that we've learned from Illinois, for instance, we'll get better there. What keeps me up at night is that delta between the current medical program and the size of an adult use program. So if we're to think that the adult use program gets going, I want us to really be prepared on a state and municipal level to have the state apparatus for regulating the system, enough of the industry equitably participated in to provide reasonable access to such a large number of consumers and supply that makes economic sense, in other words, in order to you got to do that or else you're going to have a lot of black market. It's not just the tax rate. If there's limited supply, the tax rate's small compared to scarcity, right, as far as driving prices, so that we have enough supply to deal with a very large consumer base, that we have enough accessibility, that it's equitably apportioned, I think is incredibly important from our social justice point of view. And that our municipalities are ready for not just the potential revenue that will come from businesses within their borders, but also the stress on the infrastructure that they've located. Their zoning is appropriate. They've gotten ready. They've located these businesses in such a way that if you have a 2-hour-long line outside the door, it isn't going to cause chaos with your traffic patterns or your residential areas or your business areas. I mean, these are things that ought to get thought about as we go down the path of thinking that we are going to have a very, very large market. And that's something that even Massachusetts struggled with. Some of those municipalities. I mean, it works out. What keeps me up at night is, are we thinking about all the things that have to come together to make sure that we are maximizing this moment from a cost benefit analysis for the state and its municipalities, and that we avoid missing something that'll lead to some sort of chaos, right? That is the only thing that keeps me up at night.
Now, Dr. Sabet mentioned he thinks because of this opt-out that there's going to be half of the towns opting out, and that there are only going to be a few places where this is going to be allowed that may exacerbate infrastructure.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the people that don't opt out, the municipalities that don't opt out, are going to have some, they're going to have, and if the tax rates are right for the municipalities, there will be quite a windfall. But the stress on the infrastructure with the sizing and siting of the businesses that they're allowing to have is important, because it's not like every town by far is going to be okay in the initial rounds for having these businesses. So these are important matters.
Yeah, do you think it's going to be a problem getting enough towns that are interested in allowing these things? Ruth, as well, do you think it's going to be a problem?
Big problem. Yeah. And I'm a big fan that we should respect. My personal position is while I think, and I think it's demonstrated, no state that's embraced these things have taken a significant step back, right? There hasn't been enough chaos, so people are like, oh, this was a mistake, let's try and undo it. Municipalities continue to grow. There have been a lot of opting out in a lot of states, but there's continual opting in, right? I think that the municipalities will need to come to the decision needs to be respected. I believe in municipalities determining what makes sense for their borders. And I think they need to see that it makes sense for them, and not every municipality in the state will it make sense. But then again, that goes for a whole lot of businesses, given how many different municipalities we have. But I think it's going to be a problem. It's going to be something we're really going to have to be prepared for. We're really going to need to listen to the municipalities. We're going to really need to educate that there's a lot of residual fear about this. There is a lot of upside on the other, for municipalities, a lot of residual fear. There's a lot of misperceptions. There's a lot of unknown. And we're going to have to overcome that, because if we just have a quarter of our municipalities embracing adult use cannabis, it's there's going to be some stresses on infrastructure, even at the state level at some point, if you have a lot of travel around. If we just have a lot of population on our borders that other adult use states haven't had to really deal with.
Well, here's something for you to think about. The municipality opt-out in the legislation was placed in there as a means of trying to get the bill passed. It was political, right? So senators or assemblymen couldn't support it without the opt-out, because that's what their towns wanted. That's fair. Now we're going to the people to have the people decide. If the people decide that they want it, do you need to keep the opt-out in the bill?
I suppose you don't have to keep it in the bill.
Just the thought I had just now.
I'd be very nervous about that, but I understand. And some states, by the way, some states don't defer to the municipalities. Some states defer more to the municipalities than us, and some states defer less to the municipalities than us. And I would like the municipalities to want it. And maybe that's not, and I know that's naive, but I see what you're saying. Like maybe it's sort of like, no, look, if it's zoned, it's zoned, and maybe you can have say over a number or something. There are possibilities out there, but I don't want to antagonize the municipalities either.
No, it was just something that I've thought about. It's in the ball game once it passes the ballot. So
Yeah.
all those different things that's in the 200 monstrosity of the legislation that were put in place to appease this person, it may not even be necessary. We may be looking at an entirely different landscape. So that's another thing. Now, the Cannabis Regulatory Commission is going to come in soon and take over the medical program as well as any adult use program. What do you think is going to be the initial challenge for the CRC? 5 people are going to be appointed. I think it's going to be the harder part. And I wish Evans was here to drop off. Something I'm waiting.
I will say, I just got an email from Evan. His power just went out, so he lost all of his internet connection. So he's trying to rejoin us, but he just disappeared into the ether.
Oh, well, you have to do an Evans impersonation.
Oh, I can't even come close to knowing what Evan knows about the regulatory scheme. I'll just comment briefly on your question. Again, I approach this more on the employment side, but I think one of the biggest issues is going to be dealing with the licensing that's going on right now, because the license application process from when they first opened it up and 2018 are sitting in the appellate division right now. Yeah. And nothing's happening there. So, and I think just some of the commentary that we've heard as well with respect, and your question regarding, medical versus adult use, and unless there's, some significant changes or moving of the licensing process and getting things together, I think that could create some issues. So I think they're going to need to deal kind of with that up front. Or at least I see that, especially on the litigation side, based on the cases that are sitting in the appellate division, purely on the licensing. I don't know what's going to happen with those, but they've been there for a while. So it's creating a little bit of a bottleneck in that process.
Well, bottleneck isn't the word. It's stop the expansion.
A bottle stopper, a cork maybe is a better.
A cork. So eventually it's going to get decided one way or another. I'm wondering, what do you guys think is the effect now of the program of having essentially no new licenses for the last year and change? How's that affecting the current program?
I mean, I think the program could always benefit from more participant, not endlessly so, but I think there's certainly room in our program for more competition, right? There needs to be a greater diversity of product than there is currently. There needs to be more supply, there needs to be more accessibility, and there needs to be more voices active and thought leaders developing operational capabilities in the state. So I think without them, our current industry has done great work in keeping up through COVID and really getting things done, but supply is a problem. Now that's going to be alleviated as some of the companies that had taken some time to get open and get fully open. I think it's going to be alleviated, but let's think about one thing. When the adult use program opens, it needs to have enough supply to credibly begin to even do sales for adult use. If we're struggling to meet medical demand, well, we saw like the potential difference in the amount of demand that would be in an adult use context. I think when we're going through these medical RFAs or whatever RFAs can be done, and right now only medical, while we're getting ready for an adult use moment, these are the opportunities to not only try to understand how much of these businesses do we need to meet a growing patient base, but what do we kind of need to be able to credibly at least turn the lights on in the adult use program? We're going to need these businesses. If we're already having trouble meeting patient demand, it's in order to really avoid massively delaying the adult use program, we need to start to think about right sizing, especially if the ballot initiative passes. What are the tools that the government has to try to get the program, given that they're going to be united programs, how to get enough supply and enough accessibility done before we actually get to an adult use RFA because once we do an adult use RFA, those businesses are going to have to get open. So you could be looking at 24 months from passage of the ballot before there's a first adult use sale. Hopefully it'll be less than that, but supply and just the realities of getting these businesses open need to be looked at. And what are the tools that we can do? Where can we look to get ready? And I think we can
have the medical program up to speed and being able to service all the 80,000 patients, which will be 100,000 by the end of today, and then 150,000 by next week. So do you think that we should make sure that the medical program is up and running and able to supply all of its patients before opening up the adult use?
Well, I mean, it's just if we're not able to even if you're not able to, and we are able to, but if we can't adequately, we're always a step or two behind maximizing what supply to the patients look like. If we opened up adult use without adjusting for a further substantial growth of adult use, then two things are going to happen. We're not going to be able to really get adult use going without a certain amount of chaos, because things will fly off the shelves and the patients will suffer because. Right? Where am I? I've got a reserve. Like how do I maintain? If I'm only barely able to keep up with patient demand right now, what happens if I say, okay, now we'll just start selling to a much greater number of retail consumers? What happens to those patients when they are maybe 1 out of 10 people coming through the door? So making sure that our medical program is protected and is growing involves also making sure that we're getting ready, that these businesses that we're bringing in have the capability to scale swiftly to adjust for the new influx of retail consumers while maintaining the integrity of the program and service for patients. That's just something we gotta be thinking about when we look at these businesses and what they're purporting to and what we're asking them to do when they come into the state.
Okay. How do you guys think the cannabis industry should interact with the general public on education and outreach? What do you think would be the most effective way? Because there are going to be people like Dr. Sabet that think the sky is falling and have these negative views. What can the industry itself do to educate?
I mean, I think, look, which is one of the things that's happening on this call, is education to folks that are in decision-making positions, people that are voting, people that are in those communities. But, effective, correct outreach and education is always helpful, no matter what industry you're in, particularly if you are in this type of industry where there are very strong views on both sides. I think it is incumbent on participants to reach out to their communities, be part of those communities, educate those communities, and give back to those communities in a way that promotes understanding and make sure that we're all dealing with the same set of facts when we're talking about issues, so that they can make informed decisions.
I think the one thing I would add to that, Ruth, is I think this industry, there is a great deal of opportunity to make money in this industry, and there has been. And Dr. Sabet made a point. He made a point about this, that that these businesses do well. Okay, well, they're doing well in a regulatory context that just showed up. The prohibition, just before this happened, a lot of people lost their livelihoods, their freedom, and even their lives doing what now you're going to make a bunch of money doing in a newly regulated industry. So I think there is a moral obligation, and I think also an effective way of promoting the benefits of regulated cannabis by I think the industry has to share. I mean, I think they need to be a mechanism for increasing the participation in this industry and the ability to generate profit, particularly among the people who have been beat up by prohibition for so long. And there's a lot of people that have been beaten up. There are a lot of people walking around. There are a lot of people whose families and a lot of communities that have suffered through the prohibition of cannabis, which didn't work and left a lot of hurt people. The industry has a goal, has an obligation, so does the state, to participate in trying to make that better. And I think by like I want everyone to do well, but only if they do good at the same time. And I think then you demonstrate the care, you demonstrate the quality, you demonstrate the education, and you bring together many, many voices that now are empowered by the same phenomena that ruined them in the past. And I would like to see, I think the industry has to be, that's how the industry needs to, they get the mindset that may be different than other industries. They need to have that mindset that is part of their mission.
Well, we're running out of time, but I have to get one more question to you. You're involved in other states and the industries. Are they doing that? Are the cannabis industry participants giving back to the community? Is that happening?
You know, and yeah, I mean, depends on what you mean. Is it satisfying? Have they done it right? Is there someone we can just go steal their playbook and go? But no. Is it better jurisdiction by jurisdiction, year after year? Yes. I mean, is Illinois kind of perfect? No. But is it a lot better than a lot of other places? Yes. And Oakland has, you know, in California is more local. There are a lot of new things where the industry is actually okay with doing things. I think they need a little bit of nudging from the public sector to make sure they really embrace it, but it's getting better. Of course, it's only going to get better if we make sure that it gets better. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
Thanks for that. They're about to kick us off and people are going to start popping up. But thanks a lot for the conversation. Sorry I didn't drop off the last 15 minutes, but he was great. And I appreciate everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a great discussion. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Really interactive, great information being shared, great Q&A. So now it is my pleasure to bring up our closing speaker, our closing keynote, Bo Whitney. Whitney Economics is based out of Portland, Oregon, and has clientele in the US globally. Bo is the CEO. Bo has advised small startups, large multinational corporations, and heads of state on cannabis operations, policy, and regulatory deployment. He has cannabis business experience, previously as COO of a large vertically integrated company that went public in 2015, and currently as Chief Revenue Officer at Mantis Growth Investments. Bo, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the NJBIA for the ability to, for asking me to participate today. Today I wanted to go through just a high-level overview of the cannabis industry, and I wanted to kind of help level set everybody on just where the industry is at. So I've got a global update and the US update, and then some industry and regulatory issues. So cannabis right now the reform is accelerating on a global scale. There's over 55 countries, and more countries are legalizing each day. I know that I have a friend in Kenya, they're looking at legalization. There's some reform issues in the Middle East as well. I recently presented for the president of Afghanistan. They're looking at the benefits of cannabis from an economic development, economic opportunity perspective. It's interesting to note that the legalization that occurs on a global scale really addresses the cartel issue. In a previous role, I gave some updates to the incoming president of Mexico, and since legalization occurred in the United States, interdictions of cannabis at the border have decreased 90%, and they're down 42% just since last year alone. And what's interesting in that is that's a material reduction in the amount of cannabis crossing borders. It's over 2.2 million pounds. But this pace of reform on a global scale is accelerating. As was mentioned earlier, 33 states right now with medical, 11 of which are also adult use. And people don't realize that 64% of the US population comes from states with access to adult use or legal medical cannabis. But if you include CBD, it's almost 99% of the country's population has some form of access to cannabis-related products. As was mentioned earlier, New Jersey, of course, but there's several other states that are looking at cannabis legalization this November, and about 10 other states that are looking at addressing this either through legislative reform or ballot measures next year as well. Cannabis is a job creator. Currently in the United States, there's over 375,000 jobs in the legal market alone. This is plant touching. This isn't your Scott's Miracle Grow folks that are ancillary businesses. These are retail testing facilities, growers, and processing manufacturers. And assuming that there was full legalization, even with a residual illicit market, there would be 1.5 to 1.6 million jobs. So this is pretty significant. And the potential for New Jersey is about 35,000 jobs. Right now, there's about, it's tough to ascertain, but there's about 1,000 or so jobs, 2,500 jobs. And while cannabis is a tax generator, it's not a deficit solver. In some states, it's 0.3% of the total budget. But what the cannabis taxes do is that they can help shore up some of the revenue and deficits in certain specific areas, law enforcement, education, and mental health and drug services. Question earlier was asked about estimated revenue from cannabis taxes. I've put together a model where it's looking like after about 3 years after the market stabilizes, it's about $125 to $150 million. And that could grow depending upon the regulatory structure that is deployed. In terms of healthcare, a lot of people talk about the differences between the medical market and adult use market, but a lot of the consumers are basically the same. They're trying to address particular issues using cannabis. Some just are not comfortable actually signing up and getting on a list with the government for a medical card, and so they use cannabis as individuals outside of the system. But a lot of the users of cannabis, a lot of the consumers of cannabis use it to address chronic pain, anxiety, and the like. Now, what's interesting about this is that there is data from the National Institute of Health that shows that in states with medical access, opiate prescriptions are reduced by 11%, and opiate-related deaths decreased by 27%. And so this is empirical data from a federal agency that has looked into this. I've reviewed data on the medical side in Canada with a group of veterans, 20,000 sample size, and their prescription drug usage decreased markedly by going to a medical cannabis regime. Now, there is questions about prolonged usage, increased psychoses, impact on youth, brain development, but a lot of this just doesn't have the research yet to make any definitive assertions. And so the medical community is really requesting and really asking for permission from the federal government to continue research in this area. It's very much in its infancy. Traffic fatalities, while there is data on this, the data is mixed. And more research is required in this area as well. And the key issue on this is how to define causality or impairment. I recently was on a phone call with a group of law enforcement officers in Georgia that are requesting that they be allowed to use a certain aspect of the cannabis plant called CBD, and they want to include it in their wellness program. And there are some emerging technologies to look at impairment, but for right now, the impairment issue is still an open question. But in the data, especially out of Colorado, there is evidence to show that while there is an initial spike in cannabis-involved fatalities, it basically reverts back to the mean after a period of time. It's more a function of people's familiarity with cannabis use more so than anything else. But it doesn't, I'm not trying to discount the issue of drug driving. These charts here show that there is still individuals that are willing to drive under the influence of cannabis. And it's a issue that needs to be addressed, but can be addressed via education. I think what people forget when they're opposing the cannabis legalization is that there is a multiplier effect when you combine cannabis or combine alcohol with other drugs, and there's a greater multiplier risk associated with a traffic fatality for other drugs more so than with cannabis. Teen usage has come up multiple times today, and it's very, very much in the minds and thoughts of parents and other folks. But what the statistics show is that teen usage is actually on the decline. And I think a lot of the reason behind this is that cannabis has lost the allure in the youth. And so while there's an initial spike in consumption by the teens, by people from 12 to 21, it eventually declines over time. So here's some data on teen usage post-medical deployment. Here's some data from Colorado as well that just shows that while there's an initial spike, it eventually goes down, and it actually goes down below pre-legalization levels. But once again, teen usage and addressing this is a function of education. And one thing to note is that there's a common narrative out there that shows that teen usage is, with legalization, would increase because they have greater access. But what I've found here in Oregon is that it's actually, there's less access because you're taking that supply and putting it into a very restrictive arena. In terms of criminal justice, cannabis has allowed law enforcement to really reprioritize their resources and focus in on the fentanyl and the opiates and the like, methamphetamines. But that doesn't mean that these racial disparities have been addressed. There's still a greater propensity, if you're Black, to be arrested for cannabis possession. So this is one of those areas that needs to be addressed and continually reviewed for its effectiveness. Now, there's some key issues that are impacting the cannabis industry in general. I've listed a handful here, but banking right now is very, very difficult to get when you're in the higher THC cannabis space. It's tough to get insurance, loans for your businesses, even credit card processing. And this is a public safety issue. In Oregon, for example, just recently here in Portland, there was an increase in robberies at cannabis facilities. And a lot of this is because of the fact that they have cash on hand. They're not able to put it into banks. There is some federal legislation. It's got bipartisan support, and it's got the support of the U.S. Treasury and the American Banking Association. So I think these, next to the banking and the tax code reform, will be addressed in the next Congress that's coming up here. Social equity is another issue. It's more a function of access to the opportunities associated with cannabis legalization. And in a lot of these states, there's these financial barriers to entry due to limited licensure and the regulatory structure. Interstate commerce is another aspect, another key issue impacting the cannabis industry. Right now, the way that the structure is, because of federal illegality, is that each state has to establish a siloed market. And what that does is it limits the economic growth, the size of the market, and it creates these market distortions. Some of this may be impacting the Eastern Coast states more. And there's opportunities to address the impact of these siloed markets through interstate commerce. I know that there are some efforts underway to support this concept through interstate compacts. And this is a reasonable approach that can also be taxed and used to fund social equity programs and address law enforcement and the like. A lot of the impact here comes down to basic research. You're not seeing the amount of research that is required to make definitive assertions one way or the other, but it's this lack of medical research is inhibiting the access to millions of consumers, specifically to address certain ailments like increased anxiety and pain management. Once this research occurs, there is an opportunity to add cannabinoids to existing over-the-counter drugs so that they can address a lot of these ailments that people use over-the-counter drugs for. There's some key regulatory issues. Sorry here. My apologies here. There are some key regulatory issues associated with this. So one of the key issues that impact the rollout and the effectiveness of an adult use market is the difference between illicit and legal pricing. And tax and compliance costs can impact this. Consumers are extremely price sensitive in the cannabis space. And so if you tax it too high or create too many economic burdens, then it'll slow the pace of the conversion of consumers from the illicit market to the legal market. Whitney Economics has developed some tax models that show that if you tax it correctly, not too high, not too low, you can actually maximize the amount of tax revenue while maximizing the illicit to legal market conversions. And it's not that the tax needs to be zero. I mean, at 10 to 15% taxation is about right, because people genuinely want to participate in the legal market. They don't necessarily want to participate in the illicit market, assuming that the price delta is not too extreme. Another key regulatory issue is testing. It's really critical to ensure public safety that testing labs be set up and certified in such a way as the testing results from one lab to the next are consistent. Advertising is very tricky. The question is how to promote the products to the consumers while not engaging with the youth. And part of this is, you can do this through labeling as well, so that consumers are educated about what they're getting and that they're not surprised and have a negative impression of the cannabis experience. There is this dynamic between federal and states' rights, which is impacting the regulatory side of things, and it's generally an issue about how to which jurisdiction takes authority, and then how to promote a state system in such a way that it has flexible compliance so that it avoids any federal intervention. And it was brought up earlier that supply chain management is also a big concern. And the question is, how do you ramp up and maintain the supply effectively to meet the demand without driving excesses and causing the prices to collapse? There's been a couple of states that have experienced this, and either through shortages, which maintain a robust illicit market like is experiencing in California, versus Oregon, where they drove excesses to the point where prices collapsed and it drove people out of the market. I'm gonna skip over this slide here that looks at the top 10 qualities of a successful regulated system. Basically what this does is it's taken a look at all of the currently deployed programs across the country and looks at what's worked and what really hasn't worked. And so, because I wanted to leave some time for questions, but just some closing thoughts here. So from an economic perspective, adult use cannabis legalization makes good sense. There's jobs and taxes. There's also economic development that goes beyond just the plant touching opportunities. And one thing to realize about this is that deploying a regulatory program is not easy, and it's an iterative process. So it's not going to be perfect out of the gate. And balancing public safety versus industry growth is extremely, extremely difficult, but it's not impossible. But it's going to take several legislative sessions in order to work out the kinks. The key here is education and communication. And so saying I don't know to an answer or to a question about, is this working? Is this, what do I know? What do I not know? It's okay to say I don't know, because that opens the opportunity for communication and education. But one thing that's very, very important is be sure to plan ahead, ramp the supply chain in advance of deployment. And then also consider the fact that full federal legalization is actually a real possibility. And so in developing and deploying a program in New Jersey, don't necessarily do it with New Jersey in mind, but with the thoughts that other states will legalize and eventually it'll be legal at the federal level. And one thing also in closing is this is not just a New Jersey issue, this is a global issue. It's a global industry. And so when looking at regulations and looking at issues associated with cannabis, think global, think about what's going on internationally, and then act locally to address them. So I wanted to leave some time for questions. And so I just wanted to thank you once again for the opportunity to speak today. And I'll take some questions now.
Great, thanks so much, Bo. Bo, you mentioned jobs and taxes in your update. Any idea as to how large the New Jersey market is today in general?
Yeah, it's surprising to realize that based upon the number of consumers in the space, it's a $1.8 billion market. Now, a majority of that is illicit right now, and I'm not saying that out of the gate there's going to be $1 billion in sales. It's going to take some time to ramp into that. And it's correct that it was stated earlier that not all of those participants will convert over to the legal market, but it's a very large market. It's a top 10 market in the United States.
Thanks. And then, on your regulatory section, you gave different examples, but, in your opinion, which state has done the best job deploying their adult use program?
Yeah, this is a great experiment right now, and it's a state-by-state experiment. It's not something that people have figured out exactly. And so when deploying a legalization program in New Jersey, I think it's important to look at all of these different states and pick and choose what would be most effective for New Jersey. There's no one model. There are some successes, though. I mean, Colorado, for example, they initially invited and gave priority over to the medical growers so that they could bring them into the market and get the chance for the medical growers and operators to participate in the market. They also controlled the amount of supply that would be available into the market, saying that suppliers into the space had to prove that they had demand. That's very reasonable. There are some aspects, though, from Colorado that didn't necessarily work. Low barriers to entry, or tax avoidance issues associated with deploying their medical cards and the like. Oregon, for example, has a really good lab certification program. Initially, Washington had some great data out there. So each one of these jurisdictions has some really good aspects and some challenges that they've encountered as well.
Sure. Absolutely. As you say, one size doesn't fit all, but, look, if this is going to go forward, we need to take a practical approach and understand what worked and didn't work for other states as we try to deal with the ramifications, repercussions, challenges, and opportunities that come with this. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today, for your insight and, spending time with us today. So thanks. And I want to thank all our participants for being here today, all our panelists. Look, a lot of information, and let's be honest, we started this program with one side of the story, and we finished the program with the other side of the story, and in between there was a lot of practical application. The idea of this program was to inform and give people some information to chew and think on. I encourage everybody to follow up with our speakers, if you have follow-up questions, if you agree or if you want to challenge anything you heard from any of our speakers today in order to be more informed. But most important, I have to encourage everyone, please, 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 the one time you are absolutely heard is in your vote. And now more than ever, not just on question number one, but on the future of our country in this very dynamic time that is COVID and these extenuating circumstances of early voting. Please take the opportunity to get that vote cast, to get those ballots in, to have your voice be heard, and then together, after November 3, we will come together and we'll figure out what our next steps are as a state and a nation. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today on behalf of NJBIA and all our panelists. Have a great day. Continue to be well, everybody. Thank you. Bye.